Welcome to the Journal of the Southwest Radio Hour, a production of the University of Arizona Southwest Center. I'm Jeff Bannister. Today I'm talking with Dr. Luis Coronado, Director of SBS Mexico Initiatives in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Luis has a PhD in Latin American history from the University of Arizona, a master's degree also in history from El Colegio de San Luis, and a bachelor's degree in law from the Autonomous University of San Luis Potosí. For several years now, he's been studying the cultural and intellectual history of 19th and 20th century Mexico, largely through the lens of celebrations and public rituals. He also explores the history of mass media and technology since the time of Mexico's Cultural Revolution, which began in 1910. Dr. Coronado has published articles, books, and book chapters on Mexican history, law, historiography, and legal philosophy, and his most recent work explores popular culture and cultural heritage shared between Mexico and the United States. Luis Coronado, welcome to Journal of the Southwest Radio Hour.
Hi, Jeff. It's very great to be invited, so I really appreciate it.
Luis, you are head of SBS's Mexico Initiatives program in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at University of Arizona, and you are a cultural historian, and you're a lawyer. You're trained in Mexico as a lawyer and a legal scholar. So you have quite a pedigree, and I want to ask you about all of those things. But before I do that, I'd actually like to get a sense of your sort of intellectual trajectory and how you ended up in Tucson at the University of Arizona as the head of Mexico Initiatives, and how you ended up as a cultural historian as well.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I certainly don't know how to start, but I think the first question many people gives me when they meet me, it's how you ended up here in Arizona. And I would say that the first the interest came from my master's in history that I did in Colegio de San Luis, which is a CONACYT research center on the social sciences in central Mexico, in the city of San Luis Potosí. So in the student colloquiums that they organize every semester, I met Professor Beasley, who is one of the pioneers on the cultural history applied to Mexico and Latin America. So I was really excited to meet him because I had read his work first, and then I encountered all his approach, which in many ways differed to what many other historians do with history. I found really intriguing, provocative, and really interesting his way to approach popular culture. So I was really excited to pursuing a doctorate after terminated my master's, and that's how I explored some options, either in Europe, both in Europe and here in the U.S. I was interested in other programs in the country. You have Tulane, Austin in Texas, the ones that are within the top 10 of cultural history and Latin American history in the U.S. And I came to Arizona, and he said, well, just look over our program, and basically that's how I got basically engaged with the University of Arizona.
So how did you, what is it that led you into the study of cultural history? I see that you have training in law, and I know that you actually worked in the legal field for some time in San Luis Potosí. But is there something about growing up in the city of San Luis Potosí that led you in that direction? What piqued your curiosity for history as a discipline?
Yeah, well, since I was a child, I really got interested in history and society. When I was in third grade, I remember probably that was kind of my first memory encounter myself fascinated reading about Historia Patria, which is this field that it's taught in Mexico in elementary schools, and finding myself looking at kind of the tragic and in many ways very incoherent dramatic history of Mexico, because now as a historian, it's one of the questions I found really interesting, right? Like how a country that basically has never really won a war can get something as a lesson, right, for history and make Mexicans so proud of being Mexicans, and that's intriguing. That's a historiographic construction. But back then, I just was fascinated by heroism, and the way Father Hidalgo, just basically was, raising people against the bad government, and that type of stuff was really, really good for me. And I remember my mother telling me that, my grandfather, who had already passed back then, had dreamed having a son, to study law, right? And he never did that. And so I said, I can be a lawyer too. So I, without anything in my head about what is being a lawyer, but I got convinced that was my career. So I started, when I was in high school, I decided to go into law school. And in Mexico, differently than in the US, law is a bachelor degree. So you can actually pursue, to become a career as an attorney just with the BA.
I see.
You don't need a JD. It's five years at law school, and lawyers are kind of frustrated historians, many of them, because they really love this kind of fetishist relation with all documents and dusty papers in archives, and but they pretty much admire this bronze history, that it's just basically the history of great men. It's legal history. It's basically one of the sources of law, right? History and customs is one of the sources of the law, because society basically learns from itself, supposedly, and history serves as a source of legitimation of the law. So that's why I started as a lawyer, and my hidden passion was always history since I was a child, and then at some point I became an attorney. I practiced some fiscal law, environmental law, administrative law. I ended up become a bureaucrat at the Service for Tax Revenue in Mexico. It's called SAT.
The equivalent of the IRS in the United States, right?
Exactly. It's Sistema de Administración Tributaria. So I started working there, and I really enjoyed it. It's a very kind of compelling career into, kind of being updated in what is the new legislation coming up and that type of stuff. So no, it's not very common for a civil attorney to become a fiscal attorney. It's a very complicated branch of the law. But so I practiced about, probably 2 years. And after that, I saw, I got tired of that bureaucratic, kind of dynamic. And so I started to look for options. And I saw this scholarship to become a full-time student, CONACYT, in Colegio de San Luis. And I said, well, why not? I applied. And, I went through the different stages of the evaluation until the interview and everything. I ended up becoming a student at Colegio de San Luis. And that was kind of my first encounter with what really historians do, because it is very different to what in reality, you do, to what people think historians do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just thinking about how it makes a lot of sense, though, to move from being an attorney, to having that background and that training into history. I mean, it's, the law is a world of words and precedent, as you said, and digging around in documents and taking bits of text and marshaling arguments, all of which you definitely would be doing as a historian. But it also seems like a big difference is the kind of the way that you dig around. I feel like in a lot of ways, the historical task is more inductive than law. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but you know what I mean? You dig around in archives and you might have a loose idea of a given phenomenon that you're trying to explain, but you're really trying to dig through and see what sort of bubbles up through the sources. And Mexico is so incredibly rich in archival resources.
Yeah, I concur with you. I think, since the beginning, I saw law as one of the tools, that you analytical tools you can get at your hand if you want to become a historian. I am the part of the group that believes that historians should have a very holistic knowledge and very deep knowledge, not only of the era they are looking at in the past, but also they need to have a very strong sense of the social dynamics and institutional dynamics they are where they are at in the past when they are looking at certain phenomenon or process or character in history or people or a town, right, or an event. They need to know very good about the situations and circumstances that surround that specific thing. So law is one of those. If you don't understand the legal dynamic in an era you are studying, basically you lose many of the deepness of that era. And it can be, if you don't do history of law, you can use that method to approach other people's life, right, in terms of understanding how they interact with that institutional reality. So that was kind of my first approach. But I want to tell that certainly in my master's I wanted to get as far as I could from being a legal historian. In my master's degree thesis, I certainly didn't use many of my tools as a lawyer. I wanted to, go away and explore so many other things. So I started to be interested in intellectual history and obviously cultural history, which is basically trying to understand, how, the meanings of the past are present at everyday lives in people, and another entirely different discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see that you. So I'm assuming that your first publication, I believe that's your first publication, La Alameda Potosina ante la llegada del ferrocarril,
Mm-hmm.
and that is coming from your master's thesis. Is
Yes.
that right?
Yeah. Actually, well, it was my master's thesis, and there in San Luis Potosí, there's an annual, contest for different fields of humanities and social sciences. So it's called Premio 20 de Noviembre, and it's the government of San Luis Potosí organized it to commemorate the revolution, and people basically submit their works to be evaluated by a committee, and at the end, the winner has its work. They work published, and you receive some money and a medal, and it's a very interesting ceremony with the governor when they induct you as one of the Premio 20 de Noviembre receivers. So that was kind of how my thesis became first a book.
Wow! Congratulations! That's quite an honor to have that coming right out of graduate school.
Yeah, and yeah. So and Professor Beasley actually was really nice because he knew the research way before it ended up as a 20 de Noviembre winner. So I asked him for a prologue for that work, and he did a great prologue. I wasn't expecting, that he basically did many pages in talking about my work. I was totally flattered of the concepts he wrote about the work.
Mm-hmm. And tell us a little bit about it. So the focus of the master's thesis and then book is the arrival of the train in San Luis Potosí. Obviously, an incredibly transformational piece of technology. tying together the nation state in a lot of ways, and perhaps even pulling it apart in others.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about the effect of that on San Luis Potosí and what you
Yes.
saw?
Yes, sure. Yeah, actually, as any other student, I was very fascinated when I got first to the archives, and when I went to the Central Library of the University of San Luis Potosí, I was totally fascinated in reading all newspapers back in San Luis Potosí. It was a totally different city that I used to live at. It was it had a very vibrant cultural life. Believe it or not, very different than in 20th century. That's more vibrant. It used to be High Alai, for example, which is like this. I'm not sure how to tell this in English. It's like fronton. They used to have the spaces for playing that back then, and so I started to look many notes about the coming arrival of the railroad system to San Luis Potosí since 1878. So I was fascinated how society reacted to that, expectant, but also criticizing the way the Mexican government had, do concession to foreigners, and how Porfirio Diaz was trying to bring progress. So I saw also this discourse and this narrative about technology embedded in this sort of concepts that I was not familiar with. So they talked about progress, about humanity, about the savages and the civilization in very different terms to what politicians in the present were talking about, big, public works. So I was fascinated by that. The first note I saw in the newspaper that struck me a lot, it was in 1888 there was a huge rain floating in San Luis Potosí. So this note in the newspaper, El Correo de San Luis, said there was a lot of destruction among the poor surrounding areas of the city. There were some dead people, and and many these bad housing constructions for the poor people were destroyed. So that's great because now the government can take advantage of that to align well the streets on that areas. So I was shocked
Right.
by that type of stuff. So I said, how government perceive poor back then, how people perceive technology back then. So although the historiography of railroad, it's very focused in economic impacts of the railroad. It's based probably 80% of the historiography of the railroad in Mexico is focused on how the railroad affected the market. So economic historians look more on how the peso rate with the dollar and that type of stuff. So I was kind of bored about that approach, and I found really fascinating how this railroad arrival was like a catalyzer of seeing other many phenomenons that were surrounding the city. And I saw how the city was totally different, not only intellectually, but in the mentality of the people, right? So that's why I started to do this type of work.
So it seems to me too that geographically, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but San Luis Potosí being in the kind of the center north of Mexico and north of Mexico City, and then kind of in the on the Meseta Central is a pretty strategic space or place rather for the railroad, right? Because that would be the line that the railroad might take out of Mexico City coming to the border with the United States. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. Well, it's an strategic place because you're right. It's within the center of the country, and right now at least 70% of the economic activity of Mexico is being done within the perimeter of 500 kilometers around San Luis Potosí city, For example, it's totally the same distance between San Luis and Mexico City to Monterrey to Guadalajara. And let me tell you something that may be strange to hear, but back then San Luis Potosí was even more important than Monterrey before the arrival of the railroad. And San Luis Potosí was picked of the, for doing the inauguration of that railroad track that was from Mexico City to Laredo. That was the first track that basically joined the Mexican capital to the U.S. It's because, as in the U.S., the railroad is the track is constructed from the extreme points to the central point. And so the place where the two tracks that were being constructed encounter at the end was San Luis Potosí. And that's why the last, the last nail for the last track was nailed in San Luis Potosí. And there was a huge ceremony about that.
So by virtue of that, then Mexico City and San Luis Potosí and other parts of Mexico get connected basically into a quickly emerging global economy.
Exactly. Yeah, totally.
And information economy, of course, as well.
Yes.
Because the telegraph is following that line also, right?
Exactly. So it was telegraph, it was the railroad, and also that was the inauguration was 1888, and in 1891, a different track of railroad was built coming from Aguascalientes and the Pacific to Aguascalientes and then to San Luis towards Tampico. So Tampico is kind of the gate, the gateway to Europe. So that's how San Luis became one of the most progressive cities in terms of technology in the central area of Mexico, and it was really, really important until the revolution. Just to give you an example, at least a couple of the ministers of Porfirio Diaz were from San Luis Potosí during his tenure. Right now we are very familiarized and we have normalized that presidents, travel a lot and they meet their counterparts in their cities and they have a plane and they have, these ceremonies. But back then, it wasn't the case. I mean, Porfirio Diaz just went to San Luis Potosí probably 2 or 3 times in 34 years. Right? And the first time that a president of Mexico and a president of the U.S. Met in person was under Porfirio Diaz with President William Taft at El Paso. And it took, much effort to bring the railroads to that place and have the presidents to shake hands in the very same border. So that changes a lot our perception on how the power and the control of territory is totally different now than it was back then.
Yeah, right. I can imagine. I think that it kind of goes back to one of the things that you were saying earlier, or alluding to at least, which was, when you write a national history, which often is of great men, mostly emphasis on men, the labor of creating a nation state out of whole cloth, and especially a country like Mexico that is so geographically, ethnically diverse, is a very difficult task. Exactly. And obviously that is a key kind of, axis of inquiry in Mexican and Mexicanist historiography. But it seems like the railroad was obviously a crucial element in all of that.
Yes, yeah, and I certainly, I bet that one of the most important investments that Porfirio Diaz did was to consolidate not only his power, but the idea of having as you said, united nation, right? This sense of unity, no matter the diverse ethnicities, even languages, or the regionalisms that were very, very strong in Mexico, that actually put Mexico into different eras of chaos in the 19th century. The railroad, as you said, it was an important element to create even in the symbolic, realm, the idea of that we were a nation together with Aguascalientes. Because before that, for example, traveling to Mexico from Mexico City to San Luis Potosí used to take like 7 days in horse carriage, right? So it's basically very, very different to have just to travel overnight in your even in your bed if you were part of the rich people, right? And just basically have a nap, and you ended up in San Luis Potosí and then in Monterrey, right? So it changed totally, not only the local culture, but the perception of time, the perception of the sense of having access to European goods and services and ideas, publications. We are very used to now to that just with a click, you can see what they are publishing in Japan or in China. Well, wasn't the case back then. You needed to wait for, newspapers coming from Mexico City by horse. You needed to wait for magazines. After the railroad came, that was more immediate, and you can get even access to fashion items, right? Women were wearing French clothes, and it was a total different approach to life.
Mm-hmm. That kind of technology, railroad technology, and many other technologies, of course, too, but something as grand in scale, as intense as a railroad, is a vector of deterritorialization, a vector of very fast-paced change.
Yes, no, totally right, and so that's why I got fascinated first, and that's the kind of main distinction between intellectual history and cultural history. Intellectual history look more over ideas and how ideas are first produced by a group of intellectuals, or and that are disseminated through different means depending on the era you are looking at, but also the perception, the reception and the perception, and then the interpretation of those ideas. So in my case, I was fascinated to see how kind of the core beliefs and the core ideas of Auguste Comte from France basically were disseminated into this positivist intellectual trend that just basically, leaked into the local discourses about the railroad. So how to link like this abstract idea of progress into something tangible like the railroad. Mm-hmm. That's intellectual. And the cultural is more how the people react, how people symbolize those things produced and that they are not familiar with. Mm-hmm. And, that has to do with religion, that has to do with the specific popular, ceremonies around. And you can find all those in how local people interacted with the railroad without knowing anything about, this technology.
Mm-hmm. Can you think of a particular illustration of or a story from this research that stands out to you as kind of emblematic of this process that you're talking about? Earlier, you spoke about the flooding of the outlying.
For example, I remember kind of wondering how common people used to railroad, without knowing. I mean, what was the first impression of one people that not, an illiterate person with the first encounter with these railroads? And it struck me that we have lost our sense of be amazed, right? Because certainly we are not, even children, it's not the same to look at, a cell phone and saying, you are talking to your grandma that it's, on the other side of the world. Yeah, well, that's it. And is that easy, right? But watching this enormous machine that was called, the Iron Horse, right? Kind of buffing and, steaming and, very, very noisy coming to you, it should be like a huge impression, right? So I remember reading this diary of a lady, an upper class lady, whose father owned one of the haciendas that around San Luis Potosí that were given some of their lands for the track to be installed, right? So it's a cattle. It's a minor cattle ranch, and so one of the employees of the hacienda, this pastor, like this guy who was taking care of the I think was sheep's. He was adverted, please, near to this day, don't take the cattle near to the track because it's gonna pass. The train is gonna pass, right? So obviously he didn't obey that order. So when the train passed, obviously he just was totally frightened. He jumped, behind a tree or something he described, and then he saw all the cattle or many of the sheep killed by the railroad, right, passing. So he was totally frightened, and when the hacienda owner asked him, what happened? He said, this tick, right? This basically this stream just passed. We were lucky because it passed, coming like a en la punta, right? It was just vertical because if that thing come horizontally, everyone was gonna be killed, right? So so obviously the hacienda owner laughed, and I found this story very revealing in how people who is illiterate, who is not familiar with this technology, reacted at the first place by watching it, right?
Which would have been a lot of people across Mexico.
Exactly. Yeah. And without even if other people could try to explain to them, right? If you consider that back then, probably 97% of Mexicans were illiterate, you can understand the impact of this technology.